This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Politi, Caitlin N., John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, and B. Lupita. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke, and this week we are going to talk about the goddess called Asherah. Last week we spoke about Astarte, who is another goddess in the Canaanite pantheon that we see having a strong influence in the Old Testament of the Bible. And it was when I was researching Astarte that I thought, it's really worthwhile to get into this trilogy of Canaanite goddesses and to talk about their role, especially since they become a real prime example of deities that have been demonized. As we had mentioned last week, Astarte later becomes Ashtaroth, the demon, later when we get to medieval texts. Ashtaroth seeming to be completely unrelated in terms of the fact that we're dealing with a masculine demon that has attributes that don't seem to remind us of Asherah at all, at least not superficially. There are probably elemental associations and so forth that connect the two of them. But what we're looking at this week is Asherah. Asherah is very specifically mentioned a number of times in the Bible, and she represents a certain attitude towards femininity that we see developing from ancient Israelite religion to what we take for granted now, okay, in terms of what this interpretation should be. So in this podcast, I have a mini agenda here. And so I want to talk a little bit about who she is, what her associations are, the origins and the history of her, like what we know about her background and her connections to other Semitic peoples in that region of the Mesopotamian region, roughly speaking. There's this idea of Asherah as the wife of Yahweh, and that has been brought up. And then we want to talk about the idea, we want to look at the context of that. Why is Asherah appearing in the Bible at all, given what we think we know about the Old Testament? And then I want to talk about her particular association with trees, and then what she actually may represent to the ancient Israelites. And I want to end it with a piece that I wrote for the American Academy of Religion conference. I'm trying to remember what year it was. I want to say it was like 2014, 2015. It was a while ago that I wrote. I got an award for this paper, actually, called A Marriage Without Eros. And I'm going to look at that because that takes a Jungian view on the relationship between Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the Israelites themselves. So, and it's not a view, by the way, that everybody agrees with me on, but I do think there's a very strong illustration here. I think it provides a good context for what we're looking at. So let's begin with talking about who Asherah is. Now, the strict definition here, this is a Hebrew word, Asherah, and it's also been rendered Atharat in the context of her cult at Ugarit. Her worship was very central and very important in this area as a mother goddess. She appears in Hittite writings as Asardu or Asartu, and she's considered to be a fertility goddess and is most frequently associated with trees. Now, in her roles here, it says she's identified as the consort of the Sumerian god Anu and also the Ugaritic god El. Now, El should ring a bell, okay? I did not want to say that, but somehow that's the thing that came out. El is definitely the forerunner, at least to some degree, of the God that we think of as Yahweh. Again, I talk about this last week, and I also make reference to the that Esoterica podcast. If you haven't seen that one about the origins of Yahweh, or about Yahweh, what we see of the ancient Yahweh as opposed to what he developed into as this war god of the Israelites, you might want to go back and check one of the links that I have for one of the earlier podcasts. I'll mention it down in the description for both the audio and the video versions of this podcast, so that you can go back and look at that video. But El is definitely there's definitely a strong connection between the Canaanite El and Yahweh, whether you want to think of them as the same, which probably people would argue that they're not the same. But they're definitely, one has morphed into the other. And Yahweh may have morphed from other deities as well, not just El, but El is actually specifically mentioned. In fact, in many of the Psalms, Yahweh is referred to as El. And also we think of the term Elohim, right? This is a term used for God throughout the Old Testament, and Elohim is actually a plural and suggests like a group. There's El and the sons of El. There's this whole group of deities that we are talking about that frequently get interpreted as Yahweh and his angels, because once you move to a monotheistic way of thinking about things, then we say, oh, well, there are no other gods around Yahweh. There weren't really any other gods, so they must have been angels. And the answer is no. Yahweh was part of a pantheon. If you recall the first commandment in the 10 Commandments of Moses, it says, I shall have no other gods before me because I am a jealous God. Yahweh doesn't say there are no other gods. He just says he's jealous and doesn't want any other ones around. So yeah, he's not saying you shall not worship any other gods because there aren't any. He said you shouldn't worship any other gods because there's just me. Like he's saying no, because I'm jealous of them and I only want you to worship me. So this is what we see here. And that this is going to be, as we see what the story of Asherah and how it develops, at least among the Israelites, this will become a bit apparent to you what the significance of that is. Okay, so back to what we're defining about Asherah. She has a very high rank in the Ugaritic pantheon. There is Deuteronomy 12. Yahweh commands the destruction of her shrines. Okay, now remember, Deuteronomy and Leviticus are two places people like to pull their morality from. And again, we're going to need to step back and look at the broader context of what these books mean and why they're written. The name mentions the name Dione, which you see in the Iliad. It's the only place you see this name in reference to the mother of Aphrodite. Now, Aphrodite in Greek mythology is foam-born. That's literally what her name means. When the god Uranus is castrated by Kronos, his genitals fall into the ocean, and out of the foam, Aphrodite is born. And that's literally what her name means. Foam, born of foam, okay? But in the Iliad, when there's the episode in which Aphrodite is wounded on the battlefield trying to protect Aeneas, she goes back to Mount Olympus, and she is comforted by her mother Dione. This is literally one of the only places, or Dione, however you want to say it. She's the only place where you see this name really mentioned. But here, of course, we see that this is like Elah. It means goddess, and it said it's clearly associated with Asherah and the Phoenician history of, I'm not going to be able to say that word correctly. In any case, it's part of Phoenician lore. So interesting that this Queen of Heaven shows up as a mother of Aphrodite, as a love goddess. Okay, so if we think of Astarte as this love goddess, then Asherah has something more fundamentally connected to the earth and the earth mother in the way that we see her. Now, the book of Jeremiah, they said they might be referring to Asherah when they're referring to the Queen of Heaven. The most important association that we have with Asherah is that of the tree or of the grove. In fact, when we read about her, the translation of her name in the King James Bible is grove. It has to do with a grove of trees. She is very heavily associated with trees. And that is an association that we're going to look more deeply into later in this episode. So let's get into the history of Asherah, who she is. Okay, so I'm just looking at the World History Encyclopedia. It says Asherah had not been found in any Iron Age, Tyrian, or Phoenician texts, and so the first book of Kings might hint at the verse 18, well, chapter 18, verse 19, might possibly hint that the Israelites associated Asherah with the Iron Age Phoenician goddess Astarte. That's been talked about. I don't know that Astarte and Asherah, I mean, they're part of the same pantheon. I don't know that they were seen as the same, but nonetheless, there are similarities between them due to the roles that they served, or maybe the crossover in roles. In the Bronze Age, the Canaanite Asherah, known as Asherah, the wife of El and mother of the gods, was a principal deity in Tyre, and the connection of Asherah to the maternal goddess Astarte has been a long-standing theory among scholars. However, the specific name of Astarte is also found in the Bible, such as in Judges 2 and the first book of Samuel. Therefore, if there's a connection between Asherah and Astarte, they were also differentiated for reasons unknown. Well, they're differentiated because they're different. But anyway, that's the theory that's put forth here. Okay, it says, Asherah is often interlaced with various other deities of different names and is believed to have a diverse iconography. Her mythology is hard to determine because, in addition to Astarte, she often took on attributes of Anat, who we're going to talk about next week, and Ishtar Inanna as well. In the Canaanite metropolis of Ugarit, she was known as Asherah, the wife of El, and a mother goddess as the mother of the gods. Some scholars believe she was seen as early as the 2nd millennium BCE as a popular female deity in the Hittite culture. She may have also been associated with the goddess Elat, which we have just noted is related to Dion or Dione. The Babylonian goddess Ashratu appears to be a version of Asherah, as she was known for her eroticism. The Babylonians learned of her through the Amorites. Okay, the Amorites are a group we frequently see in the Bible as in conflict with the Israelites, who saw her as the consort of the god Amuru. In Babylon, she was thought to be the daughter-in-law of Anu and was known as the Lady of the Steppes. Her association with mountains in Babylon may be a hint to her Canaanite origins. Okay, so she's associated with mountains there. So they mention here, from Canaanite mythology, El's traditions and epithets were absorbed into the construct of the Israelite Yahweh, God of the Hebrew Bible, and therefore it is likely that they acclimated Asherah as well. Archaeological evidence can be found in 8th century BCE Kuntilit Arud inscriptions found in the northeast part of the Sinai Peninsula, and I'm not sure if I'm saying that name correctly. These inscriptions are written in Hebrew and translate as Yahweh and his Asherah. Asherah is also associated with Yahweh in a similar possessive sentence in the 8th century BCE Kirbet el-Kom inscriptions found in the West Bank. So this article also brings up one of the chief questions when we hear about Yahweh and his Asherah. Are we talking about, and mind you, this is like the 900s BCE. Okay, we're talking about what this inscription was written. And this is probably around the time we might have seen some of the first versions of the book of Genesis, written down. And mind you, just thinking about that in a broader context, that's actually quite late. That doesn't mean that the beliefs didn't exist before, but when we think about Babylonian religion, when we see things like the Gilgamesh dating back to, you're talking 1600 BCE, and actually you're seeing some of the earliest texts from 2250 BCE, this is very, very late. This is like 1400 years later that we're seeing this stuff written down. And Yahweh, so we have here is this, the implication that people take away from this is that Yahweh is therefore the spouse of Asherah. Now, if we think about the fact that El, as they mentioned, El and El's epithets and El's attributes all became assimilated into the Israelite Yahweh, it's not necessarily a very far logical stretch to assume that El's wife would also be taken on by Yahweh. And in fact, it is known that in the temples or the altars to Yahweh, that the Asherah tree or the Asherah pole was frequently planted on the altar or next to Yahweh, almost as a consort or a spouse in that way. And by the way, that may not be the only meaning of that, as we're going to discuss when we get into trees and the meaning of trees. But the fact that there was this kind of, they'll refer to it in the Bible sometimes as an Asherah pole, why these were placed there. I mean, there's some kind of fertility connotation there. But the question is the Asherah simply a cultic object? Like the Israelites had other Celtic objects, cultic objects that they used. And So what was this? Was the Asherah really just some kind of a carved figure that was included, or was this a reference to an actual goddess who would have been potentially this queen of heaven, who would have potentially been the spouse? Now, here they talk about this debate. They say whether these inscriptions refer to Asherah the goddess or an Asherah as a cultic object. One reason for the debate is that in the Kuntilat Arud and the Akirba El Kam inscriptions, pronominal suffixes show Yahweh as having possession of the noun Asherah, implying that this was an object. Ancient Hebrew did not use pronominal suffixes on proper nouns such as people or deities. However, other Semitic languages closely related to Hebrew did use such suffixes. Later in Israelite Deuteronomic tradition, Asherah and all deities other than Yahweh are strictly prohibited. And yeah, the Deuteronomic period there is the key cutoff period that we have, where we see this polytheism starting. Well, this polytheism is at least being outright prohibited. Condemnations of Asherah appear to have been written in the 8th century BCE or later, cropping up at the same time as the Kuntilat Arud and, the inscriptions from those two areas. I'm not going to try to keep butchering those names over and over again. When not implying a goddess, the terms Asherah, Asherim in the Bible refer to cultic objects, which were wooden poles, images, or trees associated with pagan worship and were supposed to have been destroyed by the Israelites. The verbs connected with them in the Bible are words associated with wood, such as fell, smash, and burn by fire. It is possible that the Asherim were originally living trees, which the wooden pole developed as a symbol of Asherah to be placed beside an altar. In an extra-biblical context as well, the goddess Asherah was often represented as a stylized sacred tree. And so they were talking about the functional difference between the singular and plural of the world, with the singular being set up by altars and the plural in association with trees in high places. So yes, because there's this talk of building these altars and shrines to these deities, these Canaanite deities, on hilltops. So there is in Deuteronomy 16, it says, "You shall not plant any tree as a sacred pole or Asherah beside the altar that you make for the Lord your God." And the 1 Kings 14:23 states, "For they also built for themselves high places, pillars, and sacred poles, which they call Asherim, on every high hill and under every green tree." So it's not necessarily the trees themselves, but this is a separate object that is a pole that is carved in some fashion. So these are just two examples out of several which consistently relate separate locations for singular and plural forms. It says one theory proposed by J.R. Engel is that the plural Asherim were associated with the Judean pillar figurines, while the singular Asherah was a wooden pole. Although it's interesting and often accepted theory, there's nothing in the text that implies the Asherim were clay figures. However, along with the disappearance of the Judean pillar figurines from the archaeological record, so did the Asherah cult disappear from Judean sites after the Babylonian exile. Okay, so this is interesting because we see this is the point at which we see Asherah disappear. Now, let's talk a minute about the Babylonian exile. This happens around the year 586 BCE. It's actually, there's like a range of dates. This is the period at which Cyrus the Great is actually held up as the conquerors here that we have from Persia and from that area. That he's held up as an anointed one because he allows the Israelites to keep their temples and their worship. He doesn't try to put his own gods in there, or they're allowed to continue to worship and to have their temple as they've had it. And this is interesting because this period, what happens in this period is that the Jews actually had their own kingdom of Judah, and then there's all this empire building around this period of time between the 500s and, pretty much the 500s onward in particular. We see this empire building that's going on. We have the Mesopotamian empires, we have the Akkadian empires, or Achaemenid Empire, excuse me. We have later on we're going to have Alexander the Great, and we have all of these things, and then finally we start having Rome build their own empire after the Punic Wars. We have this idea of empire building as well. So there's this idea of conquering large territories. And in the midst of all this, the Israelites, who remember Yahweh's a war god. So they feel by being obedient to Yahweh and to what Yahweh wants, that they will achieve victory. And then when they are absolutely, utterly crushed by their enemies, and they are now exiled from the homeland that was given to them, then so now they're asking the questions. And this is a very common occurrence in human culture. There's a book I read years ago, and I think I quote it at the end of my own book, called The Lucifer Principle, and it's by a guy called Howard Bloom, not Harold Bloom, not the guy who deals with the Western canon of literature, but Howard Bloom. And towards the end of this book, he was talking about more contemporary events, but he was also talking about things like the British Empire. And whenever you have this idea of empire building, whenever you have a nation that is at its height, at a point of stability, where it's on top of the world and it dominates everything, when that dominance starts to collapse, one of the first things that people look at is the first thing that they'll turn to is the morality. Okay, or maybe in ancient times before morality was as heavily stressed, there was the idea of, are we making the appropriate sacrifices to the gods, or are we taking the appropriate actions to appease the forces of nature? And we have this here with Yahweh, because Yahweh is seen as this kind of force to be appeased, this very, very potent force to be appeased. So what happens here is when they lose, they have to stay. The question that they're asking themselves is, well, what did we do wrong? What did we do to make Yahweh angry, and how do we fix it? Which is basically what the book of Deuteronomy in particular, that's what that's about. It's during this period of exile where they kind of say, okay, now we've got to get together, figure out how we made our God mad, and now let's try to fix it. I've often said that the Old Testament is, if you wanted to sum it up in a sentence, would be the Israelites trying to figure out why they've lost. No offense, by the way, to anybody from the Judaic community. That's not meant that way, but these were little tribal wars going on all the time. And when you have this big, powerful God who you think is like the secret weapon in your back pocket, and it doesn't work, then you're kind of going, well, okay, well, why didn't it work? Let's troubleshoot here. What are we gonna do to fix it? And that's a lot of what I see going on in the Old Testament. And Yahweh is a very typical cranky and capricious ancient war god. I mean, we don't think of it that way, because now we tend to think of Yahweh's become combined with Jupiter Ammon and Jove and all of these other Zeus-like figures in a way, and as well as some other major deities from that time. There was a lot of syncretism that brought about the idea of God as we have it now, as this kind of universal figure that we see that comes out of certainly the late Roman Republican or into the Empire period. That's that image of God that you have is like this very benign and merciful father judge kind of thing. I mean, Old Testament Yahweh is a contradiction, because Old Testament Yahweh is not benevolent. I mean, can bestow his blessings when he feels like it, but if you make him mad, you make him really mad, and he's going to squash you like a bug. Which is, I think the Puritan, the Jonathan Edwards sermon of sinners in the hands of an angry God, and we think, well, gee, that's not a very nice way to think about God, because we think about the New Testament, right? We think about Jesus and mercy and the forgiveness of sins and things like that. And so this vision of God, it could be what Lewis Black said, after he had the kid, he'd calm the F down, but there is definitely a very frightening and intimidating quality to Yahweh in the Old Testament. And so when we consider the idea of him having attributes of these ancient Canaanite deities, and we look at what the biblical texts tell us, here's the thing, and we tend to think of the Jews as having this innovation, is what people would call it, of monotheism. I've read this in so many late 19th century, early 20th century religious texts. What a marvelous thing that they brought. What a unique thing they brought. And I'm like, no, it wasn't unique at all. The Egyptians already had a taste of monotheism with Aten worship, and which didn't last, by the way. And monotheism comes about, and it's not really just the Jews that do that. It's done in a way, because initially when we talk about Yahweh, the Jews were henotheists. They did worship all the other gods in this pantheon. The Jews, in fact, were polytheists probably right up until this period. Now, if we think about what's talked about in the books of Genesis and Exodus, the whole creation of the world, and then the story of Noah, and then the flood, and then their captivity in Egypt, and then the Exodus is literally about them leaving Egypt for the promised land of Canaan. Okay, so they're going to Canaan, and what are they adopted? What's in Canaan but other Canaanite gods? This is where we see this development. And so between probably the earliest period of the Israelites, probably right up until this Babylonian captivity period in around 586, at least that's roughly the starting point that we have here, the Jews were polytheists. I mean, they Yahweh was their main guy, but they still worship these other gods. Now, yes, we have the prophets that come along and say, no, you shouldn't worship these other gods. You should just worship Yahweh. That's all you should worship. But they still did. And there's actually even a quote, which I'm going to find in here in the book of Jeremiah, okay, prophet Jeremiah 44, verse 19. This is a point at which Jeremiah is telling the Israelites that they should not be worshiping Asherah. They should, or whether her name's explicitly stated or not. I'll read to it here. This is what Wikipedia says about it. Episodes in the Hebrew Bible show this gender imbalance in the Hebrew religion. Asherah was patronized by female royals such as the Queen Mother Macha, which I think it's interesting that her name is Macha, even though it has no relationship to the Macha who's connected to the Morrigan, just so you know. But more commonly, perhaps, Asherah was worshipped within the household, and her offerings were performed by family matriarchs. Yeah, she was the equivalent of like a household goddess, like you would see. We talk about the Lares in Rome. She was, or like a Hestia, like a goddess of the hearth almost. She was worshipped within the home to guarantee the fertility and the abundance of the home. Okay. It says, as for the women of Jerusalem attested, okay, this was in Jeremiah 44, it says, when we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings to her, did not our husbands know that we were making cakes impressed with her image and pouring out drink offerings to her? And it's also stated in these passages of Jeremiah where they say, we had everything. Our coffers were filled. We had abundance. We had stability. And then you made us stop. And then all of a sudden, we were in poverty, exile, and slavery. So, of course, what did they do? They said, well, obviously, it's because we stopped worshiping the Queen of Heaven, so now we're going to go back to it. Because frequently, that was the reality. They would get the prophets would come in and say, Yahweh says, no, you cannot worship these other gods. He's a jealous God. You cannot worship these other gods. And they would say, oh, okay, we're not going to worship these other gods. Then everything would go to crap, and they would say, well, you know what? This is the way you solve these problems. You're not having the proper reciprocal relationship with these natural forces. So you're saying, no, well, we need to be recognizing, respecting, and honoring these forces. And then when everything goes, and so then when everything goes to crap again, they say, that's what they're saying. Well, whenever we stop worshiping, this is what happens. So why do you want us to stop worshiping? And then the prophet will say, well, no, the reason that you have a problem is not because you stopped making offerings, but it's because you made Yahweh mad. So now he's going to punish you. So this is where we get this kind of flipped way of thinking about it. It's like, no, Yahweh controls everything. So here we see, yes, as popular culture defines Canaanite religion and Hebrew idolatry as sexual, quote-unquote, fertility cults, products of primitive superstition, which, yeah, we know how we feel about that, rather than spiritual philosophy. And there you go. That's interesting. There's eros versus logos. I talk about that, right? Fertility cult, eros, versus spiritual philosophy, the highfalutin thinking of logos, right? And of course here, what are we seeing? A direct valuing of logos over eros. This position is buttressed by the Hebrew Bible, which frequently and graphically associates goddess religions with prostitution, which we've talked, there's been some discussion about that with Mary Magdalene and prostitution as a way to devalue or debase someone, because obviously, again, we see virginity as being held to this very high standard. Hosea, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel in particular blame goddess religions for making Yahweh jealous and cite his jealousy as the reason Yahweh allowed the destruction of Jerusalem. As for sexual and fertility rites, it is likely they were once held in honor in Israel, as they were throughout the ancient world. Although their nature remains uncertain, sexual rites typically revolved around women of power and influence, such as Makkah. So the Hebrew term kadishtu, I think that's how you say it, usually translated as temple prostitutes or shrine prostitutes, literally means priests, priestesses, or priests. However, there's a growing scholarly consensus that sacred prostitution never existed, and that sex acts within the temple were strictly limited to yearly sacred fertility rites aimed at assuring an abundant harvest. Okay, well, nonetheless, there is this kind of sexual component that didn't really leave Israelite religion. And by the way, what we actually see in these books that refer to the exilic period in the Bible, when we talk about the revelations of Moses, the Ten Commandments, right? We were given the impression that all throughout the Jewish period, that after this happened, that the Jews were very aware of this and that this is what they followed. And the reality is they did not. They did not even know what these books were. It was like they were discovered in a shrine somewhere and they went, oh, look at this. What's this about? And they for years after the alleged Exodus took place and all the events associated with that, including the handing down of the Ten Commandments, that was all completely forgotten over the years. And as we'll see in the Book of Kings, I'm going to read a little bit from the Book of Kings just so you can get an idea here. I grabbed my copy. I have a copy of the New Revised Standard Bible, and just trying to make room for it here on my desk. And what we have in the second Book of Kings is there's an account of these different kings, and what they talk about is how they had... The phrase that I frequently seeing here is that they... says, okay, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay, so there's this idea, the abominable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places, this is Manasseh, rebuilt the high places in which Hezekiah, his father, had destroyed, and he erected altars for Baal, and made an Asherah, as Ahab king of Israel had done, and worshipped all of the host of heaven, and served them. Mind you, we see this phrase host of heaven in different places, and everybody assumes this has to do with the heavenly host of angels. This has to do with the Canaanite pantheon. And he built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem I will put my name. And he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. And he burned his son as an offering. See, now they're also claiming that there's human sacrifice. This gets back to the idea of Moloch worship, which, by the way, is connected to groves of trees, just as Asherah is connected to a grove. There was a grove in which one did this to Moloch. And so there was this idea that they are claiming all these bloody sacrifices and things went on. Again, that's not impossible. So it says, the Lord, he did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. And the graven image of Asherah that he had made, he set in the house which the Lord said to David and Solomon, his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever, and I will not cause the feet of Israel to wander any more out of the land which I gave to their fathers. Only they will be careful to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. But they did not listen, and Manasseh seduced them to do more evil than the nations had done, when more evil than the nations had done, whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. Okay, so then we get to chapter 22, and we have Josiah he starts his reign at the age of 8 years old, and he reigns for 31 years in Jerusalem. Now, with Josiah, he says his mother's name was Jedediah, his daughter... Okay, we don't need to get into all that. Then he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and walked in all the way of David and his father, and did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. In the 18th year of King Josiah, the king sent Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, the secretary of the house of the Lord, saying, Go up to Hilkiah, the high priest, that he may reckon the amount of money which has been brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the threshold collected from the people, and let it be given to the hand of the workmen who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. So they talk about this. So then it says, at Hilkiah, and Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan, the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. Okay, that's what I was talking about. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. And Shaphan, the secretary, came to the king and reported, Your servant has emptied out the money that was found in the house and delivered it to the hand of the workmen, etc. Then Shaphan, the secretary, told the king, Hilkiah, the priest, has given me a book, and he gives the book to the king. So after he reads this book, okay, this is where the law is rediscovered. And so then he decides that he's going to, in chapter 23, that this is where he is going to, it says, the king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem to the south of the mount, which Solomon, the king of Israel, had built for Asherah, the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abominations of Moab, and for Milcom the abominations of the Ammonites. And he broke in pieces the pillars, cut down the Asherim, okay, there we are, and filled their places with the bones of men. So he goes through and he destroys all of the pagan things. So it says he, moreover, at the altar at Bethel, the high place erected by Jeroboam, and son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, that altar with the high place he pulled down and broke into pieces its stones, crushing them to dust, and also he burned the Asherah. So he sees a tomb of a prophet, he leaves it alone. And it says, the king commanded to all the people, keep the Passover to the Lord your God, as is written in this book of the covenant. For no such Passover has been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel or the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, the Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. Moreover, Josiah put away the mediums and the wizards and the teraphim. Yeah, that's what I was talking about, these kind of ritual objects that were used for divination. Like they had to do with invoking ancestral spirits, so kind of necromantic. And the idols and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and Jerusalem, that he might establish the words of the law which were written in the book that Hilkiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. Before him there was no other king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any like arise after him. Still, now this is the best part, still the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel, and I will cast off this city which I have chosen, Jerusalem, and the house of which I said, my name shall be there. So bottom line here is this worship of Asherah and so forth has continued to go on. And Josiah comes in, he discovers this book of the old law and says, whoa, we haven't been keeping this. So he removes all of these things because, again, like I was saying earlier, there's the idea is when things aren't going right, you troubleshoot your relationship with your deity and say, oh, whoops, we're not doing the right thing, let's fix it. However, the problem is, even in fixing it, Yahweh still says, I don't care. He's behaving exactly the way you would expect, the way that we see other old gods. Okay, if I think back to the Iliad, the women of Troy weaving the cloth for Athena and making offerings at the temple to help them, but Athena turns her face away because she's not interested. She's more interested in helping the other side. So now Yahweh, he's done all of these things to try to do the right thing. And it's interesting, too, because it seems like this is a law that was just long forgotten. And now it's rediscovered, and the king says, whoa, we're going to observe this. And Yahweh's still like, I don't care, I hate you. So it's really interesting how we see this kind of relationship. He does all of this stuff, and normally you would think that the way that the script would go would that they start to observe things, and then all of a sudden things start to turn around, but they don't. It's a really interesting series of events, but we see the way in which Asherah and the Asherah poles were placed in these temples and were placed near Yahweh, whether meant to be a spouse or simply meant to be a fertility cultic ritual kind of object. Yahweh doesn't want them there, of course. Let's see. So I wanted to say a little bit of a question here. Yeah, this idea of folk religion versus book religion. This is something I wanted to get into. I'm looking at this article, the author's at the top. It's at the feminaclassica.com. The title of it is In Search of Asherah, the Lost Hebrew Goddess. And this is an important distinction that this author makes, and that is that folk religion is there's the official religion of the king, of the people, of the court, of the people who are on the upper part of the hierarchy, okay, the royal household. There's the religion that they practice. But then there is the folk religion. There's their state religion, and then there's the religion that people worship locally in their own houses. So we like to assume that because this is written down in the Bible and because it's declared by the kings that everybody's following this, but that's not usually the way it went. The local religion is something different, and it tends to be something a bit closer to the earth. It's closer to the ancient fertility rites and these things that people rely on because they're not sitting in some palace somewhere or whatever the equivalent is, sitting there being taken care of. They've got to survive, and they're still working in relationship to the earth. So those relationships are not going to be the same as the people who are somewhat removed from that because of their because of their status. It's easy for them to say, well, don't make offerings to the Queen of Heaven for abundance. Don't do this. Don't do that. And they're kind of saying, well, that to them, they're not going to let go of that, because just like now, if you have a particular belief that has been around a long time and somebody says to you, hey, you know that belief you had? That's not really what it is. People still have a hard time. You don't automatically let go of that belief. I mean, this is just saying it based. People are saying, well, yeah, but why wouldn't you give things to the earth to get things back? Like, why wouldn't you do that? The idea that now we're just going to throw all that away in favor of some angry war deity. It's like, well, but we're not interested in war. We're interested in having our livestock thrive and maybe crops grow, if that's part of the equation, or whatever. We're interested in making sure that our families are fed and safe and our households are taken care of and our children are being born. They're not interested in things that might be more of a concern to the royal household. And again, these people, and of course you have to remember that people, these we'll call them so-called common people, they don't necessarily have any literacy. They don't read and write. The scribes and the priests, or even maybe just one person who's literate who tells the priests what's said in the text, those are the only ones who are literate. This is not a widespread thing. Yeah, so what ends up happening at this point is we start to see this wholesale condemnation of folk religion, and it becomes the thing that's blamed for Yahweh's wrath, because the common people are not following the dictums. We're not particularly talking about a merciful God here. So let me take a turn and talk a little bit about tree lore, because one of the things that we see about Asherah is this connection to the word grove, a grove of trees. Now, tree groves are sacred in a lot of what we'll call pagan religions. Okay, that's not always the best term in my opinion, but certainly ancient non-Christian or non-monotheistic religions had a very strong valuing of the sacred grove. We see this with the Druids, for example, where the tree lore of the Druids. The groves are also considered to be a place where the trees, of course, have spirits. Some spirits are, again, the natural spirits, when we might think of the dryads, but then there were the belief that souls might occupy the trees of a particular forest or a grove. And the forest or grove is typically a place, it's a liminal space. It's something that's on the edge. I always think of the metaphor of the forest. Okay, and a grove doesn't have to be a forest, by the way. Usually it's a certain type of collection of trees with like an opening in the middle. But this idea of moving out into that natural spot, that collective of trees where the spirits are, where the souls of the ancestors are, this is like moving into a more wild space and into more of a numinous space in terms of where nature deities reside. There's wild animals. You see frequently the gods taking up the attributes of the wild animals that live, the wolves or the ravens or the boars that live in the forest. And I always talk about, I always use the expression fence jumper when I talk about somebody who leaves what we think of as monotheistic organized religion or Western tradition and decides that they want to go exploring. They want to go down the ancestral path. They want to go to something that existed before that. They want something more archaic, more what they would have called primitive, perhaps more primordial, that people want to get in touch with because there's something in us that calls. And it's not, if you try to look at religion as an evolution, then you will see that as a regression. But the process is not evolutionary. That is a very dated 19th, maybe early 20th century concept of the idea of the evolution of religion. And that idea suggests that people from Aboriginal tribes or people who practice so-called primitive beliefs are somehow stupid and backwards, and that religions like the monotheisms are the triumph and culmination of civilization. And we all know that that's bogus at this point, because those religions don't necessarily, all those religions, well, I shouldn't say all that they do, but one of the big potentials that they have, because they are so logos-driven, they are so driven by analysis and word and rationality and written law and scripture and scriptural interpretation, that they have completely disconnected themselves from the natural world. And then you have human beings who are left with this split between what is part of what is natural to them, and all these laws, rules, and whatever that have been dumped on top of them, that they've been told that this is who you are and this is who you have to be, and be very afraid if you're not this. So the forest tends to represent that space that one flees into the forest, so to speak. And yes, there are many dangers in the forest, but there's also this kind of hidden wisdom, because there's this idea of going into the grove and coming out with wisdom. We see sometimes frequently even something like the Buddha sitting under the tree and gaining enlightenment. There's this idea of trees, and then there's the notion of the tree of life, which is probably what Asherah represents, because she has this strong mother goddess fertility role. Tree of life is still something very important in Judaism. I mean, obviously, there's this idea of the tree of life in the Kabbalah, but there's a festival or celebration of trees within Judaism. There's the idea of the tree. Okay, the idea of the tree as also a place of gaining wisdom. Even Christ on the cross, or if we looked at Odin hanging upside down on the tree of life and gaining the wisdom of the runes, or the hanged man element in the tarot deck, this person hanging upside down, but they're enlightened because of their encounter with, or they're hanging on a tree. So there's this idea of the tree as conveying a kind of wisdom, but there's also something very primal about it. In Hinduism, we see the goddesses like Matangi, and even some of what we see of the matrikas as being associated with the forest and the people of the forest. The sages, what do when they want to go receive enlightenment? They go off into the forest, right? So there's this definite connection between trees, between the root of life, and between wisdom. And as we've just said, Asherah is often represented as a sacred tree. And so now there was a description that trees being part of an Asherah, in terms of a grove of Asherah trees that one might plant, would include grapevines, pomegranates, walnuts, myrtles, and willows. And all of those, to some degree, are associated with either love goddesses, or they are associated with the underworld. Grapevines, we think of the vine as being associated with Dionysus or Bacchus. All of these are about things that bring us very, very close to the earth, or very close to the idea of the birth-death idea. Myrtles have a little bit more perhaps of a sexual connotation. Willows actually, I think the willow probably, I'd read somewhere that they didn't have the weeping willow is something that comes out of China, so they probably are making more of a reference to the to poplar trees, type of poplar tree, when they talk about the willow. But a lot of times these are associated with Greek. They're associated. They're very, very feminine. They're all associated with very, very deeply feminine things. Walnuts in particular, it's hard to find a lot on the lore of walnuts. It's just that it's known that walnuts have properties of expelling evils, though, of expelling sickness. Okay, so that would be that sort of life-giving property. Now, whether or not that's what the ancients thought of the walnuts, I don't know. We do hear about walnut groves to certain goddesses in that region, but this strong connection to trees suggests that you're not going to let go of Asherah because she represents this connection to the life force, this connection to what we need to be nourished and to live, and in short, to the Earth Mother in that sense. But as I have noted, Earth Mother worship it's not always sweet and pretty, and this is the thing that they seem to object to. We can argue about the ethics of that, but rather than that, I think what's more interesting is what this says about the relationship of Yahweh to Israel. And so with that, I'm going to actually read from this paper that I wrote called A Marriage Without Eros. Yeah, so I talk a bit about the feminine, and I talk about this in my book too. Some of this actually I think is rehashed from my book. But the idea of what the feminine means in both the positive and negative sense, certainly in the Old Testament. Because we have figures like Eve, who ends up being regarded who ends up being translated. I don't necessarily think this is the meaning of that story, but that Eve is often translated as one who is disobedient or weak in some way, and yet she's the mother of all. So this automatically sets up a dynamic that women somehow are not trustworthy or that they are disobedient. But that's interesting too, because if we think about the fact that the Israelites believed that their ill luck came from the fact that people were practicing this kind of goddess worship, in a way it mirrors back what we see in Genesis of the idea that, everything was just hunky-dory until the women and these women mother figures started to create this disobedience or acted in this way that's disobedient. So there's almost a mirroring there. of the events, or at least of the mindset that says, yes, this is the root of our problem. This is what we have to get rid of. So let me read a little bit from this paper that I have. Obviously, I'm not reading the whole thing, but it's called The Marriage Without Eros. And I bring in Carl Jung's Book of Job here. Talk about the concept of purity. I said the ancient Israelites focused on ritual purity and strict obedience to the law, as well as avoiding pollution from quote-unquote foreign ways, as they believed this brought death and destruction. In the Bible, we see this valuing of purity associated especially with women, certainly as an exhortation against involvement with Gentile women, but the first woman brought death into the world, so women are responsible for this pollution by association. A woman who is not a virgin is considered to be quote-unquote impure. Exodus 21 tells us that virginity brings the highest bride price, and the valuing of virginity still occurs today, even though Western world gave up dowries a long time ago. And I mentioned abstinence-only sexual education programs have referred to young girls who are not virgins as used pieces of gum, among other things. I have a site that I quoted that from. The unmarried, sexually knowledgeable woman is shunned as someone potentially diseased. The good woman is the pure woman who maintains her virginity until marriage and only gives it up when she is married and starting a family. The demand for purity and obedience is modeled on Yahweh's marriage to Israel. Jung examines this relationship, which is based on keeping the covenant, and this means keeping the law. Yahweh seems to have forgotten his first wife, Sophia, because Sophia is listed as a co-creator with Yahweh, and his behavior is troubling in the book of Job, where the marriage to Israel appears to be a loveless marriage with a jealous husband. And so this is a quote from Jung's Answer to Job. It is clear from the historical development that Yahweh has lost sight of his pluralistic coexistence with Sophia since the days of creation. Okay, this is very Gnostic, but her place is taken by the covenant with the chosen people who are thus forced into the feminine role. So the nation of Israel is the bride here. At the time, the people consisted of a patriarchal society in which women were only of secondary importance. God's marriage with Israel was therefore an essential masculine affair, something like the founding of the Greek polis, which occurred at the same time. Now, remember, I talk about this idea of movement from oikos to polis and the difference in values that you have between the two, because the polis is more focused on the individual, the oikos is more focused on the tribe as a whole. And when you get into the polis, the good thing about it is you have a diversity of opinion and more individual expression. There's less of a focus, but your religious affiliation tends to be more focused on the state and not on what you need to do to take care of your individual family. Okay. At the bottom of Yahweh's marriage with Israel is a perfectionist intention which excludes that kind of relatedness known as eros. The lack of eros, of relationship to values and to the earth, is painfully apparent in the book of Job. The paragon of all creation is not a man, but a monster. Yahweh has no eros, no relationship to man, but only to a purpose which man must help him fulfill. But that does not prevent him from being jealous and mistrustful like any other husband, though even here he has his purpose in mind and not man. Okay, note that Jung also applies this to polis, as I mentioned here. The movement from oikos to polis was a move from tribal family to the city, private to the public, and paradoxically from the collective to the individual. If Jung is correct, it also shifts from the feminine, or at least from a place of respect for the feminine as life giver, to the masculine, as the impulse towards individuality is a masculine one. The rise of the polis was concurrent with concerns about the fate of the soul after death, as Orphic religious thought offered the first concept of an immortal soul in ancient Greek. Concern for the individual soul brought ethical considerations into Greek religion, as one's actions determine the fate of the soul. This change also occurred in Judaism. Second Isaiah leans towards the idea of Yahweh as savior, not only from human enemies, but from the pit of Sheol itself, which is the Jewish equivalent of the underworld. Humanity experiences death because of women's lust, and purity and obedience are required for salvation. Yahweh's erosless marriage to Israel becomes the model for heterosexual marriage and for the appropriate roles and behaviors of men and women by association. Okay, so that is what I had to say about that in this paper. And that, I think, sums up, I think this is amply demonstrated here in what we see about Asherah, what little is about her. Again, we know that she's this Canaanite mother goddess. We know that she is very highly revered as a queen of heaven, as the spouse of El. We do know that Yahweh took on all the epithets and characteristics of the god El, including the transcendent ones, because he becomes this sort of father or progenitor of creation, which also explains why Yahweh becomes a progenitor of creation in Genesis. And initially, where that relationship would have existed, this relationship is eventually weeded out as we move into this idea of the city or the kingdom that is ruled by this royal, the elite ruling class. The folk religion that might be associated with something more tribal then becomes the sinful behavior, the problem behavior, and it becomes very associated with this act of feminine disobedience. So Asherah ends up becoming this symbol of this feminine disobedience. And herein we see the paradox, because Asherah is this tree of life. She's this bringer of life that is connected with, again, the ancient Earth Mother worship is not something sweet and light. Maybe there's aspects of it that are sweet and light, because obviously they're baking cakes and offering these kinds of things, but it seems like there's some blood sacrifice too. We don't really know what the truth is about that, because most of the sources we have about that tend to be ones that are trying to denigrate it. So, but having said that, I fully would say that certainly did go on. What type of sacrifice went on, whether it was human or animal or what, I don't know. There seems to be the implication that there could have been human sacrifice, but again, this was the reality of Earth Mother worship, which is why kind of shattering the idea that Earth Mother worship is something, this is peaceful until evil patriarchy came in. I mean, well, yeah, patriarchy certainly has its evils, but it's not because it's necessarily less violent. So yes, you have this ancient goddess and all of the formidable powers associated with her. I read at least in one place that Asherah is sometimes associated with the idea of the Shekinah, which is the presence of God in the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple, in the great temples, and the Shekinah, of course, is that's a feminine word. Although you will be told by Jewish scholars that no, Shekinah is not a woman. It's really neutral term, but it just happens to be a feminine word. But there's definitely this sense of that being the vestige, perhaps, of this Asherah worship and this idea of Yahweh and his Asherah. Although, again, she's referred to as an object or a possession. But so whether he's talking about a physical object that perhaps he uses as the one who is the creator to bring that fertility, or whether or not this is actually his wife who is his consort. But we see this God that shuns any kind of feminine relationship here. And yeah, so this is at least one place where we see this privileging of logos, of rule, of dogma, of written word, of obedience, and this obedience to a kind of legal kind of a system, legalistic kind of system, without the erotic love. Although it has been pointed out to me that, like, yeah, well, there is the Song of Solomon, which is supposed to be about how Yahweh loves his bride. I'm like, yeah, okay, fair enough, but I would not say that is the way that people generally conceive of the relationship with God. People see God as a father. People don't tend to see, okay, if somebody becomes a nun in the church, okay, which I realize is not Judaism, but there's still this idea of the bride of Christ, the idea that you are engaging in this kind of marriage thing. Rarely is this, never is this an erotic kind of a union. Okay, Teresa of Avila's extreme experiences not of ecstasy notwithstanding, and those kind of experiences, by the way, are discouraged for the general populace. These ecstatic experiences of God, these direct experiences, because you have a priesthood there that mediates it. So yeah, it's just interesting to see, because what you're seeing here is the way in which something is transforming and developing into this way of thinking that ultimately ends up excluding the feminine and treating it as evil, as an act of disobedience, and which follows the pattern that we see in the book of Genesis, in the creation story that tries to suggest that it's Eve's disobedience that creates this imbalance. And as I've just said recently to my myth students, this is really a lack of affirmation of life. Something that Joseph Campbell at one point had said, it just seemed very childish to him. And again, I'm not denigrating Judaism as childish. I'm just saying that this particular narrative that we have adopted suggests there's still talk that has not gone away about the idea of sinfulness as being the result of a woman's disobedience. This idea, correct or not, whether scholars fully accept that or not, this idea has not gone away, and it certainly hasn't gone away in the way women are often treated within the culture, especially with regard to their own sexuality and their own choices. And I'm not blaming the Jews for that, by the way. Not at all. I mean, it's just, but this was, I mean, it was an ancient tribal idea. These were the rules. This was the way that they operated, and it was the way they operated within their own tribe. Okay. It's just later that everybody decided that they were going to riff off of those rules, and in addition to combining with some other ones and deciding that this was the way that they were going to go with it. So very, very interesting historical kind of a lesson there. A lot there that people, again, some listeners here may be fully well aware of all of this and be fully educated in it. Other people, this comes as a surprise. So, because everybody, we've been taught things. I remember being taught things in Catholic religion class when I was in Catholic school about this type of historical progression, and certainly it was not emphasized that the Jews were practicing polytheism all this time. But it is that the Bible does try to represent it as something that makes Yahweh angry. And I'm saying, well, okay, is it because they describe it as an evil? But I'm like, well, is it an evil, or is it just Yahweh doesn't like it because he's jealous and mistrustful? And hey, I've only said that without respect and trust of your spouse, you don't really have a marriage, do you? So comes across as I think the whole point of this is it comes across as not only a loveless relationship, but almost an abusive one. And although people would argue, well, which Yahweh would argue, well, I'm the God, who cares? I can do what I want. I can squash you like a bug. That's kind of that's the thing, which this brings into this whole idea of the fear of God, and is God fearful or merciful? And anyway, it's part of the huge problem that I have with monotheism, and why I'm not really inclined towards it, because I just don't think a system like this, unless you're using it the way Marx suggests people are using it, that it necessarily benefits people. One has to break out a little bit into these more individual experiences. Maybe ideally that's what Christianity should have done, but Christianity frequently gets misused the same way that this kind of material gets misused as well. So it's just something to, along with everything else, it's one of many things we need to think about, but that we frequently don't think about because they're part of a narrative that we just take for granted in Western culture. All right, that's it for me for now. I want to thank you so much again for listening. Thank you once again to my patrons who I thanked at the beginning of this podcast. If you would like to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/Chthonia. You can view all my work, not including the podcasts, but not only including the podcasts, but also including my publications and other things that I have been working on. I usually give the fullest updates on what I'm working on Patreon, so that is the place to go if you want to keep up with all of the work that I'm doing. And you can find me on social media, Chthonia Podcast, one word, on Twitter and Instagram. I'm always going to call it Twitter, and 2 words on Facebook. And actually, I'm getting to a point where I might actually get off Twitter, but for right now, I'm still there. Thank you so much again for listening, and until the next episode.